Hello everyone, welcome back to the Great Edge workshop. I've been sitting on the fence over whether to produce a video on the topic that I've decided to cover for tonight. As you can guess by the fact that I'm watching this, I've decided to go ahead, but what was bouncing around in my head was, on the one hand, it's such a fundamental topic to all aspects of sharpening that it needs to be discussed, really. But then the flip side of that, it's also such a simple concept that maybe it doesn't actually warrant a video. So I've decided I'm gonna create the content. I'll put it out there. If people decide that it's useful, well, hopefully people decide that it's useful. But if not, it's going to be a short video anyways, and quickly overlooked if you decide it's not for you. But the topic to discuss today is burr formation, and the reason why I want to discuss that is because whether or not you have a burr is pretty much the source of the solution to just about any problem that people encounter with sharpening. A common one, fostered by a certain amount of impatience, is if you've been working on a knife for a while and you feel like, okay, surely that's enough time. It must be, I must have reached an apex by now. If you don't check for a burr and you just move on because, well, I've served enough time, or you check for a burr and you don't find one and you think, well, maybe I'm just not feeling it properly, I'm just going to move on anyways, surely it's there, or maybe it's a very fine burr on this particular knife or this particular steel, then you move on through your grit progression with your Tormek or work sharp belts, and you get to the end and the sharpness is really disappointing. Maybe can't even slice magazine paper, or provides a very big number on the best tester, for example. So making sure, especially with the coarse grinding at the very start of sharpening, sticking with it until you reach until you raise a burr, almost guarantees that you're going to have a good result at the end of your sharpening. Now, there's some handling and technique and things that you need to pay attention to later on in the process, honing, etc. And that's a topic for my next video. But sticking with that initial grind until you feel a burr on one side and then on the other side. If you are stubborn and persistent and consistent about that point, generally your sharpening results are going to be more consistent and more favorable and more reliable. Now, if you've watched some of my earlier videos or some of my other videos with Tormek sharpening, even with a work sharp, you'll know I favor grinding one side, flipping over, and grinding another side. That's all the way through the sharpening process. So that the reason that I do that is it gives me a better chance to arrive at the same number of grinding passes on each side of the bevel, and keeping therefore the apex centered relative to the spine of the knife. Not everyone does that. Some people will grind one side until they reach a burr, then flip the knife over, grind until they feel a burr, and then they move on through their grit progression. But I like to do one side of the knife, so one pass this way, one pass that way, and keep going back and forth until I start to feel a burr forming. What I mean by a burr, before we go further in the explanation, is that actually, so I'm grinding edge leading, so the stone is coming towards me as I'm grinding, and that's pushing bits of metal up in sort of curving up almost like that. I mean, obviously that's a hugely exaggerated example, but it's what I feel is when I push my fingers off the edge of the blade, I feel like there's a little bit of hooked metal along the bottom, and if I can feel that all the way along the edge, then I know that I've done an even job of grinding from heel to tip. If I can only feel it in certain places and not all the way along, then that gives me an area of focus next time I do a pass on that side. That could be another useful point with the burr. Is not just that you wait until you grind until that first moment that you detect it, but also that you detect it evenly from heel to tip. Secondly, what I am expecting is, because I've done an even number of passes, is that I'm going to reach the point when a burr is forming on one side and then and on the opposite side at around the same time. In other words, when the burr first appears for me this way, after having been grind a pass from my right to my left, when I flip it over and do left to right, I should feel a burr forming on this side. Once I'm confident that I've got one on both sides, what I like to do is as a final check is to get the burr back on one side, flip it over, and check that the burr flips over. I developed that technique and started implementing that because of a very unusual situation that I encountered once, where I was grinding a very dull knife, and if you could imagine, the bevel came down either side, and then there was a flat spot across the bottom of the knife, and it was actually possible to have a slight burr from both of those sides, even though there was a flat spot in the middle. So I didn't have an apex centered in the. I didn't have a genuine apex on the knife, and so this idea that you can feel the burr on one side and then switch the sharpening direction around, and the burr flips over to the other side, tells me that I've got a true apex. Now, to clarify, in that unusual circumstance that I had, where I had a burr actually on each side, I had two burrs. One of the things that I do when I'm getting towards the end of sharpening with a particular grit is I feel for the burr this way, and then I run my fingers over the backside, and there it shouldn't be possible. So because the steel has curled up this way, curled up around the apex that way, I don't feel the burr if I go along the backside, and I do feel it on this side. So I can tell that it's only here, sharpen the other way, and then it's only here, and now I know, okay, the burr is flipping from one side to the other, it's even from heel to tip, I'm ready to move on. Sticking with that and persisting until you have a burr that is even from heel to tip and that flips from one side to the other, as I said, almost guarantees that you're going to have a good result by the end of your sharpening. Besides impatience as the enemy of getting to the stage where you have a burr, the other common one thing to watch out for, and I've clamped this knife like this deliberately, is if you're clamping your knife in the knife jig very, very close to the spine, what you can get, especially with the SJ 250 stone, where you can apply a little bit of pressure in sharpening, is some flex in the knife. The camera's probably not going to pick that up, but actually, as I push on the jig, there's a little bit of flex here, and so that's flattening out the edge angle, if you can imagine that. And so, if you are grinding for a particularly long time and not achieving the burr, that's one thing to watch out for. But generally, if the knife is well clamped, if your angles are correct and good, then with a reasonable amount of time, you should be able to reach a burr. If you do feel like, surely I should have established a burr by now, the answer isn't to move on to the next grit. The answer is to stop and check. Okay, what's going wrong? Do I have some flex in the jig, or maybe my knife angle is exceptionally shallow? Maybe I'm trying to go from 25 to 15. A knife that has a 25 degrees per side bevel on it, and I'm trying to change that to 15. And you can answer that with the Sharpie method. So putting a bit of Sharpie along the bevel on both sides, grind it off, and then you should be able to see how close you are to the actual apex. And if you are quite close, then keep going. You're almost there. If you're a long ways away, maybe there's a setup or the angle isn't as you expect. There's a few troubleshooting things to check. But one thing never to do is say, right, I've been sharpening on this grit, this angle for long enough, even though I can't feel the burr, surely it must be time to move on, because you will always, always, always be disappointed when you get to the end and do your sharpness test with that. Okay, good. I hope this has been helpful. As I said, we're not going deep into knife sharpening insights here, but sticking with your grinding until you feel a burr on one side, and that it flips to the other side when you turn the knife over. will solve so many challenges and issues, and why isn't my knife getting sharp, etc. So worth having in the back of your mind when you're sharpening your next knife. Right. Thanks everyone. Thank you for tuning in if you're still with us this late in the video, and see you next time.